Have you ever believed that a Bigfoot once sat quietly before a fireplace, reaching out to a grieving widow so she could gently untangle barbed wire from its arm? No roars, no panic, just silence. Thick, tense, and impossibly human. And that was only the beginning. Contrary to every myth, this creature didn't run, it led. It left willow branches bent like arrows, rough wooden toys at the doorstep, and footprints. One large, one small, side by side, because the truth is, some beings only appear when you've lost everything else. This isn't legend. It was recorded by Ruth Calder, a 57-year-old widow living alone in Spearfish Canyon, the kind of place where miracles aren't supposed to happen. In the next 8 minutes, you'll witness a mythical creature who chooses mercy, a woman who risks her life to keep a silent promise to the wild, and a child saved, not by man, but by myth. Ruth cut bullets, broke traps, and even tore undeveloped film to protect what she knew couldn't be explained. And when they left, there was no roar, no goodbye, just a gnawed willow twig at the gate. The forest's quiet farewell. If you've ever felt the world is too cold, don't skip this story, because somewhere out there, something is still watching over us. Under a sky swollen with rain, Spearfish Canyon breathed in silence. The final breath of summer clung to the earth with the weight of memory, and the storm rolled down the black hills like a slow, heavy drum. The forest, soaked and shivering, pressed in on a clearing where a half-rotted civilian Conservation Corps cabin slouched against the wind. It had been forgotten by time, but not by Ruth Calder. She sat inside with her back to the cold stone hearth, knees drawn close, her wool coat soaked through and her boots heavy with mud. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The fire in the middle of the room, a makeshift pit where a few snapped pine boughs hissed and popped, was the only voice between her and the storm. It cast a dull orange flicker across the water-stained logs and the rusted nails poking through the walls. Her eyes, soft but sharp, scanned the warped doorway like someone expecting an echo to return. But none came. Only wind, only rain. She hadn't meant to get caught out this far. Ruth had lived alone on the edge of Lawrence County for nearly 20 years, since after the accident, since the silence took root in her house and never left. Today, she'd come further into the canyon than usual, following no particular trail, just the way the trees leaned and the light shifted. She carried her old thermos and a leather satchel stuffed with sketches and pencil stubs. Nothing more. No gun, no radio. No reason except maybe something old in her bones that had asked for stillness. The knock of wood outside wasn't sharp. It was slow, like something leaning against the cabin's wall to catch its breath. Ruth didn't move at first. She waited. Her fingers tightened around the steel blade of her pocket knife, but her hand stayed low. The air changed. Not colder, but charged, like the moment before thunder hits. Then it came into view. Through the doorway, no door, just the dark mouth of the forest bleeding in. Something shifted. A shadow. Taller than a man. Thicker in the chest and shoulder. It ducked. The way a person would, almost politely. And then it stood fully in the room, the shape of it blurred by water and mist, dripping like the canyon walls themselves. Ruth didn't breathe. It didn't speak. Of course it didn't. It just stood there, soaked fur plastered against thick limbs, one arm pressed tight to its side. Something coiled around the forearm. Barbed wire. A long spiral of it, cutting deep into the flesh, rust flaked with blood. Its chest rose and fell like a furnace, slow but loud. Ruth's eyes went to the gash near its elbow where the wire dug worst. It hadn't screamed, it hadn't groaned. It had come here in a storm and stepped toward the fire with deliberate care. The thing, she didn't dare call it a beast, not even in her thoughts, crouched slowly near the far side of the fire. Its eyes stayed lowered. It didn't look at her. not once. Only extended its massive hand toward the warmth, resting its knuckles just beside the dancing flame. The smell of wet fur, old iron, and the faint, metallic sting of blood hung thick in the air. Rain kept falling outside in curtains, masking everything else. Ruth's ears rang with its weight. Her breath showed in puffs, even this close to the fire. She waited until the rhythm of the room settled, until the thing's breath matched hers. She didn't speak. Words felt useless here. She took the knife, not with a sudden move, but a calm one, like drawing thread for stitching. She rose to her knees and inched closer, letting the fire cast her shadow across the floorboards like a second figure joining them. When she was close enough to see the ridges in its fingernails, she saw it flinch, not from fear, but restraint. "I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered, barely more than a breath. She wasn't even sure why she said it aloud. The creature didn't respond, but it didn't back away. She gestured to its arm. Her hand trembled slightly, the knife catching firelight. It raised the limb, slow, deliberate, and held it out. Wrist turned slightly, offering. The wire had cut deep. In some places, the flesh had tried to swell over it. She pressed the blade against one of the strands and began sawing slowly. The sound was small but sharp, metal on metal. A spark flew. The creature didn't move. Its muscles clenched, then released. She worked in silence, using the dull edge of a broken pencil to wedge the wire apart when the blade wouldn't cut alone. Her breath quickened with each coil loosened, her fingers sticky with blood. The cabin's walls creaked under the weight of wind. But inside, the world had narrowed to a single rhythm. Cut, pause, breathe. When she was done, she set the knife down carefully. The wire dropped to the floor with a sound like a snake shedding skin. The wound wept blood but didn't spurt. She reached for a scarf from her bag, an old flannel one, frayed at the ends, and wrapped the arm gently. The fabric darkened quickly. Still, the creature remained, silent, unmoving. When she finished, it lowered its arm, placed its palm against the floor, and pushed itself upright. Not abruptly, not like something frightened, like something finished. It didn't look at her. It didn't need to. It turned slowly, the way people do when they don't want to spook a deer, and it stepped back into the rain. The fire hissed again. She didn't sleep. Not really. Just sat there, listening to the storm pull at the roof like an old man shaking loose bad memories. When dawn began to lift the corners of the forest, Ruth rose and stepped outside. The storm had passed. The air was clean in the way only mountain air can be, rinsed of everything but truth. The mud squelched under her boots as she rounded the cabin's front step. And that's when she saw them. 2 stones, smooth, river-worn, about the size of plums. They were placed side by side in perfect alignment, like someone setting direction. They pointed, not to the trail back toward town, but toward a barely visible path down the slope, where moss grew thick and the deer didn't tread. Ruth stood still for a long while. Then she took a step forward, just beyond the ridge, in a patch of softer mud near the roots of an old cedar. She saw it. 2 sets of footprints. One large, the heel deep, the stride wide, and beside it, smaller ones, lighter, matching it, step for step. She followed them with her eyes until they disappeared into the trees, and then she smiled. Not wide, not joyous, but with the kind of softness that comes when something long buried stirs again. The forest whispered behind her, the scent of pine and moss thick in the morning light. She didn't pick up the stones. She didn't need to. They weren't left for her to take. She simply turned toward the trail they pointed to, where the moss parted like a curtain, and walked on. The wind had changed again. It came now from the north, crisp and dry, combing through the grasslands like invisible fingers sifting for secrets. Autumn had sharpened the edges of everything. Shadows stretched longer, Colors burned richer, and silence didn't just fill the air. It pressed against the ribs like something living. Out past the last gravel road of Spearfish's south rim, where the old fences zigzagged like tired stitchwork across the prairie, Ruth Calder stood still beside a crooked post, her fingers brushing against rusted wire as if it could speak. Something had moved the fence. Not just wind. Not animal. A section of posts near the tree line had been pushed outward, careful, as though someone had created a door without taking it off its hinges. The ground beneath was packed in with soft impressions, too wide for deer, too soft for cattle, too clean for anything that walked with hoof or paw. She followed them only with her eyes. Then she turned her face toward the barn, where a flash of movement drew her gaze like instinct. Lainey Brooks had climbed onto the weathered steps outside the calf pen, her red windbreaker catching the low morning sun. The girl's dark curls bounced as she crouched down to inspect something, face scrunched in the kind of frown that comes not from fear, but from trying to understand a thing that doesn't make sense yet. In her small hands was a toy, not plastic, not bright. Something made from raw pine or ash. The grain still visible, shaped into a crude figure, arms outstretched. No face, the kind of thing no store would ever sell. The wood was dry and smooth in places, rough in others, like it had been carried too long in a pocket that also held stones. "I found this just sitting here," Lainey said, not looking up. "It wasn't here yesterday." Ruth didn't answer at first. She stepped closer, careful with her footing, as if the ground itself might shift under too much pressure. The toy sat now on the step between them, looking back without eyes. Ruth crouched, the stiff joints in her knees popping loud enough for Lainey to glance over. "You recognize it?" the girl asked. "No," Ruth replied softly, "but I've seen hands that could have carved it." Lainey didn't ask what that meant. She just stood, dusted her palms against her jeans, and looked toward the open fence line. "Something's out there again, isn't it?" Ruth didn't lie. She hadn't since the summer when Lainey's mother stopped coming back from her shifts at the diner, since Ruth had started bringing her homemade bread and cold milk and listening more than she talked. She followed the girl's gaze. The opening in the fence yawned like a breath someone hadn't finished taking. "I think it's been watching," Lainey added, voice low. Ruth said nothing. She walked to the shed and grabbed her jacket, the canvas one with the torn cuff and smell of cedar. She tucked the knife inside the pocket again. Then she called for Wyatt. He arrived in his usual way, engine rumbling in the distance before his blue truck crested the hill like a slow answer. Wyatt Riggins, 34. Soft-spoken, but with the kind of voice that made people listen, even when he wasn't sure what to say. He parked without asking questions. He knew the way Ruth looked when something in her gut had moved. Together, they walked the line. The grass gave way to the edge of the creek, where willows leaned into their own reflections and the sound of water murmured like a secret just out of reach. It was Lainey who saw it first. A branch, thin but strong, had been snapped near the top and bent downward, wedged between stones to keep its shape. It pointed into the woods, not haphazard, not broken by wind. Bent deliberately. A signpost for someone who didn't read the way people do. "That's not natural," Wyatt muttered, crouching beside it. "No," Ruth agreed. "It's a message." The three of them followed the direction of the arrow in silence. The forest here wasn't thick, but it held a stillness that felt older than the pines. Deadfall crackled underfoot. Birds stayed quiet. It was Lainey who noticed the ridge first. She slowed her steps and pointed upward, where the rock jutted out like the lip of a great bowl. Standing on that rise, framed by the sky behind her and the earth beneath, was a figure. Big, still, watching, a breath caught in Ruth's throat. The morning light haloed the fur around the creature's shoulders. In her arms, barely visible at first, was another shape, smaller, covered in the same coarse brown-black hair, but with limbs curled tight against the chest, like a child tucked into sleep. No one moved. The creature didn't growl, didn't flee. She simply stood. Let them see. Then, with a shift of weight and a lift of her thick arm, she turned and vanished behind the ridge. Lainey took a step forward. She was holding it. Ruth nodded. She's a mother. They climbed the ridge slowly, careful not to disturb the space where the creature had stood. Ruth ran her fingers across the stone, still warm from the touch of something impossibly large. She bent down to inspect the dirt near the edge and found it nestled in the silt like a coin tossed from a hand, long gone. Thin, oval, rusted at the corners. A piece of tin, stamped with the letters CCC and a faint date. 1934. She held it up to the light. This belonged to someone. Wyatt tilted his head. You think it's been there this whole time? No, Ruth said. I think someone placed it here. They stood in quiet a while, each turning over their own thoughts. Ruth tucked the tin into her coat, near her chest. They made their way back without talking much, the wind picking up again through the trees. It tugged at coats, curled around necks, made the leaves chatter like old women sharing gossip they swore not to repeat. Back at the house, Lainey went inside to warm up. Wyatt lingered by the fence, his eyes scanning the tree line. You saw her too, Ruth said, standing beside him. I did. You've seen her before, haven't you? Wyatt hesitated. His hands, always fidgeting with something, picked at the corner of his belt. 2 years ago, he said finally. Late season. I was out checking trail cams near Slaughter Creek. Thought I saw a bear at first. Then it stood up. You didn't say anything. No one would have believed me. I wasn't even sure I believed me. You're sure now? He looked her full in the eyes, his voice low but certain. I'm sure. They stood there a moment longer before Wyatt added, We can't tell anyone. I wasn't planning to. They nodded in quiet agreement. An oath sealed not with hands or words, but with the kind of look two people share when they both understand what it means to keep something sacred. That night, Ruth sat by the fire alone. She laid the tin piece on the mantel beside a pine cone Lainey had painted years ago, back when she still believed in fairies and bedtime stories. The flame crackled, and the wind whispered outside. She watched the firelight catch on the edge of the tin like it might still carry a glint of the man who'd worn it. The wind shifted again. She thought she heard movement out beyond the ridge, but she didn't rise to look. Some things didn't need to be seen again to be remembered. Some paths were better walked in silence. The storm had been crawling over the plains all afternoon, slow and heavy, dragging a bruise-colored sky behind it. By dusk, it was already breathing down from the north rim, curling its long fingers through the cottonwoods and rattling loose the last gold leaves of fall. Thunder rolled low like something pacing just out of sight. Ruth stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the dark line of trees, wind tugging at her coat. There was something about this one that didn't feel like any other autumn storm. It felt closer, hungrier. And she knew before she saw the open gate, before she saw the wet tracks leading down the slope, that something was wrong. The house was too still. The dog hadn't barked. The girl was gone. Inside, the kitchen light flickered with the first electrical growl of the night. The radio had lost signal hours ago. Ruth found Lainey's red jacket draped over the back of the dining chair and the boots she should have been wearing still by the door. She called once, then again louder, but the house didn't echo back. Her breath shortened. She grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the yard as the rain began to spit, cold and stinging. The wind had wiped away most of the footprints, but Ruth had lived long enough in this place to know how to read more than dirt. There were marks in the dew, broken stems in the grass, the kind of silence a child left when they moved too fast without thinking. And it was heading toward the ridge, toward the edge, the canyon where the rocks fell hard and sudden after rain. She moved faster than she had in years. Her boots slipped in the softening ground, hands brushing against bark and bramble. eyes sweeping every shadow for movement. Lightning licked the sky in white forks. The crack of thunder split the air behind her. She shouted Laney's name once, and it vanished into the wind like smoke. Then, there, a flicker. A red sleeve just beyond the edge of the overlook, clinging to a sapling bent too far forward. Ruth froze. The girl was there, hanging by one arm over the edge of the ridge, feet scrambling for purchase on the slick rock, hair plastered to her cheeks by the rain. Her other hand was bloodied from trying to grip where the moss had given way. The drop beneath her was steep, at least 40 feet to the rocks below, now glistening with the first wave of storm runoff. "Don't move!" Ruth shouted, the words barely carrying. She dropped to her knees and reached out, crawling forward inch by inch, her palms flat, her body low. But the rain made everything a blur. Her fingers kept slipping. She needed another foot, another inch, and then something shifted beside her. The first time she saw them, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Just movement to her left. But it wasn't a deer, and it wasn't Wyatt. The creature stepped forward with no sound. Its massive foot landed beside a flat stone, toes gripping the edge. Then another foot. It was the young one, not the mother. Smaller, maybe 6 feet tall, but dense with muscle and covered in wet, dark fur matted flat against its chest. The air around it smelled like cedar, wet soil, and something faintly electric, like the inside of an old storm cellar. It moved quickly but not frantic. Its long arms uncurled, and it dropped to all fours, pressing one hand flat into the earth between Ruth and the girl. And then it did something neither of them expected. It stomped once. The sound was deep, like a drum beat struck into the bones of the ground. A small shock wave pulsed out from its foot and flattened the mud just enough for Ruth to grip the ledge harder. She lunged forward, grabbed Laney's wrist with both hands, and pulled with every inch of weight she had. Her back screamed. The girl's sneakers kicked hard against the stone, scrambling until her knees caught traction. And then she was up, collapsing onto Ruth's chest, both of them heaving, gasping, shivering in the open sky. Laney looked up first, her eyes locked with the creature's. Only a few feet away now. It was crouched low, not tense, just watching. Rainwater poured from its brow, ran down its cheeks, dripped from the tips of its fingers. It blinked once, then placed its hand gently onto the dirt again, palm open, as if to say, "See, you're safe." Laney didn't scream. She didn't flinch. Her lips trembled, but her voice didn't break when she whispered, "It helped us." Ruth didn't speak. She was staring past the young one. On the ridge above, half shrouded in mist and leaning just beyond the storm-washed trees, stood the mother. Her figure was nearly lost in the downpour, but the slope of her shoulders and the shine in her eyes gave her away. She didn't move, just stood there like a sentinel, watching over them all. Her breath was visible in the chill, curling up like smoke from a fire that burned steady but distant. The girl and the woman and the young one below were safe. And only then did the mother turn, disappearing back into the fold of trees without a sound. By the time Ruth and Laney looked back, the young one was gone too. Only the storm remained. It took an hour to climb back up the trail, their clothes soaked through, hands numb, cheeks stung red by wind. They didn't talk much on the way home. Ruth kept a hand on Laney's shoulder, steady, firm, as if reminding herself that she still could. When they reached the house, the rain had softened to a whisper. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Ruth pushed open the door, guided Laney inside, wrapped her in a dry blanket. She stoked the fire with shaking hands and set a kettle to boil. Her own limbs ached, but she didn't sit. Not yet. She stepped outside once more, needing air, needing space, her boots pressing soft into the wet ground. The sky was lighter now. The storm had passed. A weak moon pushed through the thinning clouds, silver and quiet. She turned toward the fence, and something caught her eye. On the highest slat, snagged between the warped wood and a bit of old wire, fluttered a scrap of cloth. It wasn't there this morning. She stepped closer, her breath catching as she reached out to touch it. A piece of flannel, faded pink. The hem torn at the edge, the pattern barely visible now. But she knew it. She'd sewn that patch herself nearly 30 years ago, for her daughter's favorite jacket, the one they never found. Her hands trembled. She held the fabric up to her face, eyes stinging. Someone had brought it back. She didn't cry, but she stood there a long time. The night breathed gently around her. Somewhere out in the trees, too far to see, something watched. Not threatening, not near, just present. She didn't go back inside right away. The porch light buzzed softly behind her. The sky held its hush. She stayed until the fire inside began to dim, and the kettle's whistle called her home. But even then, she glanced back once more toward the tree line, her fingers still curled around the cloth. And somewhere in the dark, the silence blinked back. The frost had crept in overnight. A thin veil of white covered the dead grass like ash from some old fire, clinging to fence rails and pine needles, dusting the tops of the hills with silence. The first breath Ruth took that morning tasted like iron and cedar, cold, sharp, and full of old warnings. She stepped out onto the porch with her thermos and stared toward the ridgeline, where the sun had yet to touch. A few birds called weakly from the birches, but mostly the world held still, bracing for something. The call came just before noon. Gus Haver's voice crackled through the CB with a flat urgency that didn't leave room for hesitation. "Ruth, you better come out near White Hollow. Bring Wyatt." That was all he said. They found him waiting near the old service road, boots muddy, breath blooming in small white clouds. He didn't waste time. Just pointed toward the trees where the snowmelt hadn't fully claimed the shadows yet. "It's in there," he said, his voice low, eyes avoiding theirs. "Snare line. Looks like a predator set it. Big teeth. Too clean for an accident." Ruth and Wyatt pushed in first, boots crunching through frosted undergrowth. The light thinned beneath the canopy, dimming to that green-gray color that made it hard to tell time. Then the air changed. Quieter, denser. The sound of pain wasn't loud, but it was steady. A low, strangled breath, hitched at regular intervals, not animal, not quite human. And then they saw it, the young one. Its leg was caught in a steel trap, teeth sunk deep into the muscle just above the ankle. Blood darkened the snow beneath it, melting a slow ring of heat into the earth. Its torso was curled inward, body trembling with effort not to cry out. One arm pressed tight against its side. The other reached just slightly forward, as if unsure whether to crawl or collapse. Its face, if you could call it that, was twisted with pain, but the eyes remained alert. Scared, yes, but not wild, not broken. It saw Ruth first, then Wyatt, but it didn't snarl. It didn't run. It didn't even flinch when Ruth stepped closer, slow as breath, hands held wide. And just beyond the trees, barely visible behind a wall of bramble and fir, the mother stood, not moving, watching, tall as memory, broader than the space allowed, her fur dark with morning frost, and one hand resting against the bark of an old pine like a sentinel. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with her child's. But she didn't step forward. She didn't intervene. She stood her ground, eyes fixed on Ruth and Wyatt like a question held in the mouth. Ruth dropped to her knees, heart hammering, fingers already reaching into her coat for the folded canvas pouch she kept wrapped in the old bandana. Inside, pliers, gauze, alcohol, linen strips, the same kit she used on horses, dogs, once on a boy who fell through a barbed fence chasing cattle. She laid the tools out slowly beside her, not speaking, not rushing. Wyatt moved in behind her, keeping watch, hands loose by his hips. He never reached for his sidearm. "I'm going to cut it," Ruth whispered. Not to Wyatt, not to the creature, but maybe to herself. You just hold on." The young one didn't move. It breathed heavy, deep. It blinked once. Ruth took that as permission. She slipped the pliers into the hinge of the trap and felt the tension groan. The steel was old, rust around the hinge, but the spring still held strong. She braced her knee against the ground, pushed with everything she had, and the jaws loosened. Enough to slide the leg free. Enough for the breath to shift. The second the trap opened, the blood flowed faster. Ruth pressed gauze hard into the wound. The young one winced but didn't pull away. Wyatt took off his scarf and handed it over. They wrapped the limb tight, layered the fabric, tightened the knot, and waited. The young one closed its eyes for a second. Not in pain, in relief. And still, the mother hadn't moved. Gus called out from the edge of the trees, voice low. "We've got company." They turned. Mitch Black stepped into the clearing like he'd been waiting for applause. Rifle slung over one shoulder, sleeves rolled high, grin fixed tight like something carved in bone. His eyes went from Ruth to Wyatt, to the wounded creature. "Well, I'll be," he said, voice cold. "You actually found one." Ruth rose slowly, placing herself between the trap and Mitch. Mitch didn't stop walking until he was close enough to smell the blood. "That's real, isn't it? I thought y'all were crazy." Wyatt shifted his weight. "Don't," Mitch laughed once. "Relax. I ain't gonna shoot it. Not today anyway. Just need the trap. There's blood, fur. That's enough." He leaned down and yanked the trap up from the ground, dragging part of the bloodied snow with it, holding it up like a trophy. "Proof. You know what folks'll pay for this?" Ruth's jaw locked. "It's suffering." "So did my cousin's bull last winter," Mitch snapped. "Nobody cried when I skinned that bastard out back." He turned to leave, the trap swinging from his hand like a bell, red and clanging. When he disappeared into the trees, Gus exhaled. They waited. Minutes passed. The young one didn't move. The bleeding had slowed. Ruth touched the bandage again, gently. Then she looked back toward the mother. She had stepped closer. Still silent, still massive. Her eyes met Ruth's, and this time she nodded. Not a gesture of thanks. A gesture of understanding, something ancient and final in the tilt of her chin. Then she reached forward and touched the bark beside her, the same pine, and pressed her fingers in, deep enough to leave a mark. Then she vanished into the trees, her child crawling behind her, slow, careful, but not afraid. Ruth and Wyatt didn't speak on the walk back. Gus led. The wind picked up. That night after the fire had died and the rain had started, Ruth found something in the mailbox. Not a letter, not a package. A folded piece of paper, creased, water-warped, with an old hand-drawn map. The corners had symbols scratched in charcoal, barely legible, but the center was marked clearly. A tunnel, old mine shaft, limestone cut, left abandoned since the late 30s. Ruth traced the lines with her finger, heart beating steady. A way out. Not for her, not for them. But maybe, when the time came, for something that needed to disappear. She folded the paper, tucked it into the hollow behind the kitchen drawer where she kept things no one else saw. The kind of secrets that didn't belong in journals or locked boxes. And outside, beyond the frost, the forest waited. Winter came in hard that year, without mercy or grace. By mid-December, the limestone canyon had frozen beneath a crust of snow and silence. The wind screamed through the gorges at night like something not quite human, and the animals had already moved lower, leaving only tracks and the bones of things left behind. Ruth felt it in her ribs, in her knees, in the spaces between breaths. That kind of cold didn't just press down from the sky, it rose up from the earth. And yet something in the ground still stirred, something that didn't fear winter, something that wanted it. Mitch had started early. They found the first bait pile near the base of the bluff. A butchered pig, limbs severed clean, the blood frozen mid-drip over pine needles and dead moss. The stench cut through even the cold. Ruth had to turn away, one gloved hand pressed tight to her mouth. Wyatt crouched beside it, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. Fresh, he muttered, brushing frost from the meat. Laid down sometime last night. They spotted 2 more piles deeper in. One by the old limestone ledge, another near a gully half hidden by snowdrift. All of them circled by crude metal traps, rigged with tension wires and half-buried spikes. The kind of thing meant to maim, not kill. Meant to make something bleed out slow. "He's trying to draw them out," Ruth said, voice thin. Wyatt nodded once. "Or corner them." Ruth looked to the tree line. It felt wrong. Not just the traps or the bait or the way the wind seemed to shift whenever they turned their backs, but the quiet. The land had gone still, like it knew something ugly had been laid into its skin and couldn't shake it off. They found Sheriff Klein at the service road 2 hours later, his cruiser half frozen over, coffee steam curling up through the open window. He stepped out when he saw them, scarf pulled high over his jaw, eyes tired. "Don't tell me," he said. "Mitch?" Ruth didn't answer. Wyatt pointed toward the ridge. "He set bait up near the canyon mouth. Traps too. Real nasty ones. He's building a line." "Jesus," Klein muttered. "I can cite him for illegal burning. Maybe illegal baiting if I squint. But unless he's hunting something on the books, I got no law to stand on." "It's not pigs he's trying to catch," Ruth said. "I know." Klein looked away. "But you and I both know what happens if I put that in writing." Ruth didn't press. She knew what it meant to be cornered by rules too narrow for truth. The law only reached so far, and Mitch Black always knew just where it stopped. That night, they worked in the dark. Ruth and Wyatt moved silently through the canyon floor, dragging pine boughs behind them to mask footprints, laying out false tracks with old work boots they'd tied to broomsticks. Wyatt carved out mock prints in the snow, bigger, deeper than any man's, and trailed them south toward the creek, where the wind always changed direction. They worked fast, breath fogging, nerves taut. Somewhere behind them, in the upper tree line, something cracked. They froze. Wyatt turned slowly, rifle slung, but hands down, only silence. And then, a branch snapped clean. Something heavy, but not running, not crashing, watching. They didn't speak, just finished the pattern and pulled back toward the ridgeline. In the distance, across the slope where Mitch had set his traps, the faint orange glow of fire began to rise. "Son of a bitch," Wyatt whispered. The next morning they returned to find smoke still rising from the ash heap near the gully. Sheriff Klein had come early, following the report from a hiker who'd seen the flames late. The sheriff stood near the blackened edge of the trees, hands on his belt, looking like a man already out of options. "He'll say he was burning refuse," Klein said without turning. "He's already got the permit." "It wasn't refuse," Ruth answered. "He was baiting the line again." "Doesn't matter," Klein muttered. "He knows the rules better than I do, as long as no one gets hurt." But someone had. Not someone. Something. Near the pit, one of the traps had been tripped. Inside it, nothing. But blood had soaked the snow for yards. Tufts of dark fur clung to the barbs. Wyatt knelt beside it, fingers trembling as he peeled one thick strand from the steel. "It's hers," he said. They stood a long time at that site, the air sharp, the light flat and unforgiving. Mitch was nowhere to be seen, until later that night. The knock came just after sundown. 3 short raps on Ruth's door. She opened it to find nothing but the wind, but at her feet, left deliberately on the worn wooden boards, was a single object, a button. Not new, old brass, flat-faced, stamped with the word Liberty, and worn nearly smooth. She knew it instantly. From an old jacket, a work coat, CCC issued. She stared at it, her breath catching. Then she looked out toward the tree line. Nothing, only wind. She bent slowly, picked it up, turned it in her palm. Someone had left it for her. A reminder, a warning. That night she didn't sleep. She sat near the fire, turning the button over and over. In her other hand, the scarf she'd used to bind the young one's wound, now dried and folded. She thought of the map hidden in the drawer. She thought of the tunnel, the old mine shaft. She thought of how many exits the land could offer, if you knew how to read its bones. In the morning, the traps were gone. Every one of them. Yanked clean from the earth. The bait piles, too. Scattered. Burned. Even the ashes had been swept up, as if the land itself had decided to spit Mitch Black out. But he wasn't finished. That afternoon, Gus came by with news. "He's gone up into the North Cut," he said. "Took dogs." "Dogs?" Ruth asked. "3 of them, hunting breed, big bastards." "Did Klein stop him?" Gus shook his head. "Said he couldn't. Says it's open forest." Wyatt didn't speak, just pulled his coat on and walked out. Ruth followed. They didn't say it aloud. But they both knew it wasn't over. That night she found something else on her porch. 2 small stones, laid side by side. And this time they weren't pointing away. They were pointing back, toward her, toward the cabin. And tucked beneath them, nearly hidden in the crack of the wood, was a photograph. Black and white, blurry, almost too dim to make out. But in the center, under a tree bent like an old man's back, was a shadow. Tall, broad, watching. Ruth turned it over. Nothing on the back, but the paper smelled like ash. Wyatt came later, holding the matching corner of that same photograph, torn from the edge. He looked her in the eyes. "I didn't take it," he said. She nodded, and neither of them said the other part out loud. Someone else did. The fire crackled between them. The night pressed close. And from somewhere far off, deep in the limestone canyons, a single sharp howl broke the air like a blade through cloth. And they knew. Spring didn't arrive like a bloom this year. It came more like a wound reopening. Slow, raw, reluctant. The thaw rolled down the hills in sheets, ripping at the ice-crusted soil and dragging months of silence back into motion. Water churned through every ditch and hollow, turning trails into veins and creeks into threats. Ruth stood at the kitchen window and watched the creek behind the barn turn brown with runoff. The snowmelt had carved a new path through the pasture, and the trees swayed without rhythm, like they too weren't sure if this season was meant to bring life or loss. She set her coffee down without sipping it and pulled on her boots. Something in her chest had shifted with the water, something unsettled. Laney had gone out earlier that morning to check on the calf pen, bundled in Wyatt's old denim coat, cheeks red with cold. The girl had grown tall over the winter, but still carried herself like the wind might pick her up if it tried. Ruth had warned her not to go past the old oak fence, not today, not with the way the ground was moving beneath them. But when the house went quiet again, and the coffee turned cold, Ruth stepped out to find only the sound of water and wind, waiting. She called once, no answer. She called again, still nothing. Her heart dropped like a stone. She turned toward the tree line and saw it, just beyond the ridge. Laney's boot prints smeared and shallow, already melting into the mud. The gate was open. A cedar branch, stripped clean, lay across the trail like something had marked the path in panic. Ruth didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, her knife, and ran. The forest was louder now. Not with bird song or breath, but with the sound of everything breaking loose. Water gurgled from places that hadn't flowed in years. Trees groaned under the weight of mud. Ruth's boots sank with every step, and branches whipped across her sleeves as she climbed down the slope. She saw flashes of red through the brush. The frayed end of Laney's scarf tangled on a branch, her name scrawled in blue marker near the hem. Ruth's chest clenched. Then she heard it. A scream, not high, not long, but short, cut off like someone had gone under. She broke through the last line of saplings and reached the edge of the flood path. What had once been a trickling stream was now a roaring channel, wide and fast, clawing at its banks with wild, frothing fingers. And there, 20 feet downstream, Laney. The girl was caught in the current, fingers clawing at a log, boots slipping on the slick gravel beneath. The water shoved her sideways every time she tried to move. Her eyes were wide, teeth chattering. She saw Ruth on the bank but couldn't reach her voice again. Her foot went under. She slipped. The current grabbed her fully and pulled. Ruth jumped into the stream without thinking, but before her boots touched water, something else did. A shape dropped from the ridge upstream, slamming into the flood like a fallen tree. The splash erupted like thunder. The creature hit the water broadside, back bent, legs digging in, arms flung wide. It wasn't the young one. It was the mother. Her roar didn't come from her mouth, but from her body. A presence that thundered through the water more than sound. She braced herself in the shallows, legs planted like stone. Then, with a single motion, she swept one arm through the current and caught Laney mid-float. The child slammed into her chest like a bundle of soaked cloth, and the creature twisted, lifting her up and out with a motion so natural it didn't look forced. Laney hit the bank hard, rolling once before Ruth caught her. The girl coughed, water sputtering from her mouth, eyes blinking like she couldn't tell if she was alive. Ruth wrapped her arms tight around her, pressing her to her chest, not caring about the wet, not caring about the cold. She looked up. The mother was still in the water, crouched low, arms still wide. Her breath came in heavy gusts, steam curling from her shoulders. She didn't look at Ruth. She looked past her. Then, like a boulder shifting, she stood and turned, wading back into the deeper current until her shape disappeared around the bend like something being reclaimed by the woods. Ruth held Laney until the girl could sit up. Her fingers trembled as she brushed the wet hair from her forehead. "I couldn't," Laney's voice cracked. "I tried to get back." "You're safe," Ruth said. "You're safe." Wyatt arrived minutes later, his truck stuck halfway up the service road. He ran to them, breathless, knees in the mud, arms out. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't have to. He looked toward the creek, eyes scanning the water, and saw nothing. Just broken limbs and fast-moving foam. But he knew. That night, back at the house, Laney slept on the couch by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they could find. Her breathing was even, her face pink again. Ruth sat beside her with a towel in her lap, slowly drying the girl's boots with shaking hands. Wyatt sat across from her, holding something in his fist. He opened it slowly. Inside, his camera, wet, mud smeared. The film door had popped open, but the roll inside was still there. He slid it out, hands slow, reverent. He stared at the negative for a long time. The strip curled, stiff with damp. But one frame near the middle had caught something. A shape, a shadow rising from the water, arms flung wide, body braced in motion. Not fully clear, not clean, but enough. Ruth didn't move. He handed it to her without a word. She held it up to the light, and then, with hands that didn't shake, she tore it down the middle. The rip cut through the image with a soft hiss, a line down the middle of silence. Wyatt stared at the torn strip. His mouth opened once, then closed. Ruth set the pieces in the fire. "There are things," she said softly, "that don't belong in pictures." He didn't argue. Outside, the creek kept moving. The next morning, Ruth walked the fence line alone. The wind had picked up again, brushing the grass in slow waves. The trees groaned, and when she reached the far edge of the property, just where the land dropped into the outer fold of Limestone Canyon, she saw them. Footprints, deep, wide, pressed into the softened mud like reminders. They didn't lead away. They led in, into the canyon, into shadow. Smoke curled upward in the distance. Far off, on a high ridge where the birch trees bent low, a column of gray spiraled into the morning light. Not from a chimney, from a signal, a warning. Mitch was in the woods, and he was starting to burn it all. The wind had shifted, not just in the way it moved across the canyon floor, but in the way it carried something new, something scorched and bitter. The dry snap of brush under boot, the howl of dogs cutting through timber, the unnatural silence that followed the hiss of smoke. By the time Ruth reached the ridge, smoke had already begun rising in tight gray spirals along the limestone wall, crawling low like it knew where to go. She could taste it before she saw the flames, could feel it stinging the soft place behind her eyes, dragging winter's edge into a new season of danger. The spring thaw hadn't dried the canyon yet, but it would, and Mitch had counted on that. Wyatt stood beside her, shirt dark with sweat, breathing steady, but not calm. His rifle was slung behind him, forgotten. In one hand, he held the edge of a wool tarp soaked in water from the cistern behind the shed. He didn't speak. He just nodded once toward the canyon floor where shadows moved too fast for wind. Dogs. 3 of them. Black and tan hounds bred for size, noses to the ground, legs built for terrain. They tore through the lower brush like it was nothing, kicking up soil, snapping at roots, dragging their handlers behind them by leash and bark. Mitch led the pack, grin tight on his face, his body wound with adrenaline. His eyes didn't scan for trees or traps. They scanned for movement, something bigger, something worth the noise. Sheriff Klein had come, but late. He trailed near the trailhead with 2 deputies and a notebook that wouldn't matter. His voice was lost in the rising wind. He'd told Mitch to stand down. Mitch had laughed in his face. Now it was too late. Ruth turned to Gus, who stood a few yards back with a can of kerosene and an old bandage wrapped tight around his shoulder. He looked smaller than he had in winter, more hunched, but his eyes were still sharp. "We do it now," Ruth said, "or they corner her." He didn't argue. They moved fast, cutting through the narrow path behind the old fence line. Ruth knew it like breath now. Every turn, every ridge, every hollow that echoed differently depending on the season. They carried soaked burlap, shoveled fire breaks, and double-checked the cave shaft that Gus had mapped for them months ago. They weren't trying to start something. They were trying to make a way out. The mine mouth yawned black behind a curtain of ferns and soot-stained limestone. The ground here had always stayed cool. Wyatt dropped down first, lighting a flare, letting the shadows stretch. Ruth followed, then Gus. Inside, the shaft curved downward, splitting into veins like the inside of lungs. It would be confusing to anyone who didn't know it, but Ruth had memorized it weeks ago, just in case. By late afternoon, the smoke had thickened. The canyon trembled under the sound of barking and shouting. Fire snapped near the western lip, feeding on dry pine and leftover bait piles that Mitch had stashed weeks before. He'd planned this. Maybe not all the way, maybe not smart, but enough to make it dangerous. Then the barking changed. It wasn't the bark of a scent found. It was the bark of panic. Ruth turned her head and froze. Up near the second ridge, just where the limestone dropped into shale, she saw her, the mother. She stood half-silhouetted by smoke, crouched low, arms tense, legs braced. The young one was behind her, barely visible, clinging to the ledge like a shadow. Mitch saw them at the same time. His voice tore through the trees. "There! There!" The dogs lunged first. 3 black blurs, fangs bared, feet pounding. They moved like muscle and fury, toward something they didn't understand. And the mother moved to meet them. She didn't roar, didn't charge. She dropped low, swept a fallen limb like a club, and struck the first dog sideways, knocking it through the underbrush with a yelp that shattered the tree line. The second snapped at her flank. She turned, backhanded it across the jaw, and the third froze, eyes wide, whimpering, retreating before it could be next. Then came the gun. Mitch raised his rifle fast, faster than he should have. He didn't aim long, just enough, but he never got the shot. A shape moved between him and the beast. Gus. He came out of nowhere, stumbling from the tree line like a man chasing his own ghost. He stepped into the barrel's path just as Mitch squeezed. The shot rang out. It hit Gus in the shoulder, again, spinning him backward into the dirt, but not dropping him. He stayed on his feet. Blood soaked the bandage. His breath caught, but he didn't fall. He looked Mitch in the eye and didn't move. And the mother didn't either. She could have lunged, could have broken every bone in Mitch's body, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped back, arms spread, putting her body between her child and the barrel. She didn't bare teeth. She waited. Mitch lowered the gun slowly. Not from mercy. From fear. He'd never seen something choose not to kill. Behind them, the fire cracked louder. The wind had turned. The flames shifted direction, cutting back into the slope, toward the ridge where they stood. It would trap them all if it wasn't stopped. Ruth turned to Wyatt. His hands were already moving. He grabbed the flare, lit a bundle of dry needles, and set it downwind. "Backburn," he said quietly. Ruth's breath caught. "You sure?" "It's this or we get cooked." They moved fast, lighting a counterline against the fire's front, letting the new flames eat the fuel before the real blaze could reach it. The smoke thickened. The air choked. The heat punched from both sides. In the swirl of gray and orange, the mother disappeared into the cave mouth with her young one behind her. No sound, no gesture, just gone. The fire raced, then staggered, then split. And when the sky opened again, and the smoke thinned, the sheriff's voice echoed through the hills. They'd caught Mitch's men, the two who'd followed the bait trail with cameras and knives. They were pinned near the outer ravine, panting, coughing, their gear melted, their stories broken before they could be told. The dogs were gone. Mitch was on his knees. Sheriff Klein cuffed him in silence. No one cheered. No one needed to. They brought Gus down on a stretcher just after dark. His arm clutched against his side, jaw clenched but eyes still watching. The young one had stood at the canyon's edge the whole time, just out of reach. As the paramedics lifted Gus toward the truck, the creature watched him, didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. And something in its eyes, something deep and raw and too human, held there, a kind of sorrow that had no sound, a thank you too big for words. And as the truck drove away, taillights cutting through smoke, the young one stayed on the ledge, still watching, still waiting, and then it was gone. Summer returned quiet that year, not with fanfare or wild bloom, but with long grasses bending in the wind and sky so wide it looked like it might never close again. The trees were full but hushed, their canopies softened with dust from dry roads and memory. In Spearfish Canyon, the smoke had long since lifted, leaving behind only the faint scent of ash that still clung to fence posts and the low corners of old barns. Ruth stood barefoot in the morning dew, her heel pressed into the earth where the frost used to bite. The field beyond her porch stretched open and green, too green, and it made the silence louder. It had been over a year since Limestone Canyon last screamed. She walked the fence slowly that day. Wyatt and Laney were already out, a few yards ahead, working at the split-rail gate they'd been rebuilding since spring. Their hands moved in rhythm, Wyatt hammering steady, Laney passing him the nails like she'd done it all her life. She had grown taller, stronger. Her laugh was fuller now, even if she didn't use it much. They didn't talk about that week anymore, but they carried it. Ruth could see it in the way Laney sometimes watched the tree line too long, or how Wyatt's eyes sharpened whenever the wind shifted suddenly. No one had seen Mitch since the arraignment. He didn't get jail time, but he didn't come back, and Ruth wasn't sure which felt worse. The fence had always marked more than just boundary. It was a line between memory and what came after. The old posts had been there since before Ruth's hair turned white, since before Laney lost her mother, before Gus took a bullet in the same shoulder twice. Now that line was lower, on purpose. Wyatt had cut the new section down to just over 3 feet, high enough for deer to hesitate, low enough for something else to pass through if it chose. Ruth stepped close and ran her hand over the top slat. The wood was still raw, still smelling like sawdust and sap. And then she saw it, just there, wedged neatly between 2 rails where they met at the corner, a willow branch, gnarled, chewed down, the bark stripped clean, not fallen, placed, its ends tucked just enough into the grain that wind couldn't take it. It sat there like punctuation. She didn't call to the others. She just stood with it a moment, hand hovering, not touching. Her breath caught in her chest in that way it did when something returned you to a place you hadn't meant to revisit. They'd been here, not just passing, not just once, but recently, quietly, without sound, but not without meaning. She looked past the fence, across the open slope. The field shimmered in the sun, but there was something more. The tall grass had been parted, not trampled, not wind-bent, just parted, like two halves of a curtain pushed open, and in the center, bare earth. A narrow, curved path, only a few steps long, leading nowhere in particular, leading through. Lainey had seen it too. She stepped up beside Ruth, fingers still holding a hammer, her eyes tracing the same line in the grass. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice smaller than it had been last fall. Ruth didn't answer right away. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a folded cloth, the last piece of her daughter's scarf. The corners had frayed. The color had dulled, but it still smelled faintly of something warm, of firewood and sweat and childhood. She'd carried it too long, waiting for a moment when it felt right to let it go. She walked a few paces past the fence and knelt at the edge of the slope. There, where the earth softened, she pressed the scarf into the ground, not buried, not hidden, just placed, like an offering, like a goodbye that wasn't meant to be permanent. Wyatt didn't speak. He watched from behind, hands at his side, dirt under his fingernails. He understood. No one said the word thank you, but it hung in the air. The sun dipped lower, the light turned gold, and the wind passed through the grass in waves, soft, rhythmic, slow. Each blade bending in unison, not against the force, but with it. Like they knew something older than speech, like they'd been taught by footsteps larger than man's, the kind that didn't crush, only moved through. When Ruth stood again, the scarf didn't flutter. It stayed. They all turned then, quietly, making their way back toward the house without looking back, not out of fear, but out of reverence. That night, the house was filled with the sound of normal things. The kettle boiling, Wyatt laughing at something Lainey said, a joke half told with her mouth full of biscuit, a screen door creaking shut, the hum of the radio faint in the background. Ruth sat in her chair by the hearth, legs tucked beneath her, eyes closed but not sleeping. Her mind wandered, not to fear, but to stillness. She dreamed of the canyon. Not in fire this time, but in rain, soft, slow rain falling over the ridges, steam lifting from the rocks. In the dream, she stood at the mouth of the old mine and looked back. In the tree line, something moved, but it didn't run. It raised a hand, large, gentle, familiar, and laid it against its chest, and then it was gone. In the morning, the scarf was still there, but the willow branch was not. Ruth didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The grass had leaned again, parted just slightly, as if something too large to name had passed through in silence. And somewhere out in the canyon, far from roads and law and language, a mother walked with her child, unhunted, unseen, but not forgotten. Ruth walked the fence once more that morning, the sun warm on her shoulders. And just before she reached the end, she stopped and looked back at the path. She whispered into the wind, not loud, not certain, "Keep the shape of the grass." And the grass, ever so gently, bowed in return. Some stories are never truly over. They don't end with answers or loud farewells. They end like the turning of a season, quiet, slow, and full of things left unsaid. What matters most often isn't the noise of what happened, but the hush that follows. A space where understanding lingers, where we're left to ask ourselves, what do we carry forward? What do we leave behind? This was never just about fear or survival. It was about recognizing the thread that runs between all living things, even when the language is different, even when the shape is unfamiliar. About how silence can say more than a scream, how trust is built not in a moment, but across many small acts of mercy, and how the most powerful kind of connection isn't loud or easy. It's the kind that holds its ground even when everything else burns down around it. We live in a world that moves fast, that rewards what can be explained, what can be proven. But not every truth fits into words. Some truths are felt, in a gaze held just long enough to mean something, in a gesture offered with no expectation, in the simple act of choosing not to look away. Compassion is not always convenient, but it is always necessary. And sometimes what we choose not to do, the shot we don't take, the story we don't sell, the fear we don't feed, matters more than anything we do. There's a beauty in keeping something sacred, in honoring the wild without trying to tame it, in knowing that coexistence doesn't require conquest, only care, that perhaps the greatest form of strength is restraint, and perhaps the deepest kind of humanity is found in how we treat what we don't fully understand. So, if you felt something listening to this story, a quiet pull in the chest, a memory stirred, a sense that something real lives just beyond the edge of what we can see, hold on to that. Let it shape the way you move through your own world. Gentler, more open, more willing to believe that kindness leaves a trail. And if you ever find yourself at a threshold, uncertain and afraid, remember, sometimes the unknown isn't there to hurt us. Sometimes it's there to remind us how human we really are. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story touched something in you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections in the comments below. And if you'd like to be here for more stories that speak to the heart and linger in the soul, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next one. Until then, keep the fire warm and the silence sacred.